My boyfriend's brother was given less than a year to live, and one terrible decision destroyed an entire family. Even now, typing those words makes my stomach twist because it feels impossible that everything that happened afterward started with a single phone call from the hospital. Before that day, our lives were ordinary. My boyfriend, Ethan, and I had been together for 4 years. We had talked about marriage, children, buying a small house somewhere quiet. His older brother, Noah, was the complete opposite of Ethan. Where Ethan was loud, confident, and always planning for tomorrow, Noah was calm, funny, and somehow made everyone around him feel comfortable without even trying. We weren't especially close, but every family barbecue, every birthday, every Christmas, Noah was the one making everyone laugh while secretly washing dishes so their mother didn't have to. He was simply good. None of us imagined that someone like him would walk into a hospital with headaches and blurry vision and walk out with a death sentence. The diagnosis shattered everyone differently. Ethan became angry at the world. He punched walls, cursed doctors, and spent hours reading miracle stories online. Their parents cried almost every night. Noah, strangely enough, smiled. Not because he wasn't scared, but because he said he didn't want the people he loved spending whatever time he had left watching him fall apart. He joked during chemotherapy. He teased the nurses. He kept apologizing for being expensive. Every time I visited, he thanked me for coming, even though I felt guilty because all I did was sit beside him and pretend everything would somehow be okay. Looking back now, I realize he was comforting us more than we were comforting him. As the months passed, Ethan slowly disappeared into work. At first I understood. Medical bills were stacking up and someone had to keep life moving. But work became an excuse for everything. He missed hospital visits. He skipped family dinners. When Noah asked if Ethan could come over and watch one last football game together, Ethan claimed he had an important meeting. I later found out he wasn't working at all. He was sitting alone in bars because he couldn't face watching his brother die. I wanted to be angry, but grief doesn't always make people kinder. Sometimes it makes them strangers. Ethan stopped talking to me too. Every conversation became about schedules, prescriptions, or money. We stopped being a couple and became two exhausted people living in the same apartment. Without even realizing it, I started spending more time with Noah than with my own boyfriend. Someone had to drive him to appointments when his parents couldn't. Someone had to help him carry groceries after treatment left him too weak to stand for long. At first, it was simply helping family. Then it became routine. We'd sit on his porch drinking lemonade because alcohol made him sick. We'd watch old movies and argue about which endings were overrated. Some days he would tell me stories from when he and Ethan were kids. Other days he'd sit silently staring at the sunset as if trying to memorize every color in the sky. He never complained about dying. Not once. He complained about missing future birthdays, future road trips, and never getting to become the uncle he always dreamed of being. Those conversations broke something inside me. One rainy afternoon, Noah admitted something I'd never expected to hear. He said, "Everyone keeps treating me like I'm already gone." I asked what he meant. He looked out the window and laughed quietly. "People hug me like it's goodbye every single time. They don't ask me about movies anymore. They don't argue with me. They don't tell me bad jokes. They only ask how I'm feeling." I didn't know what to say, so instead I started acting normal. I teased him about his terrible taste in music. I laughed when he accidentally burned grilled cheese sandwiches. For the first time in weeks, he smiled without forcing it. It felt like I'd given him a tiny piece of the life everyone else had already taken away. Meanwhile, Ethan grew colder. One night I begged him to spend time with Noah because he kept asking about him. Ethan exploded. He screamed that I had no idea what it felt like watching his best friend and brother slowly disappear. Then he accused me of caring more about Noah than about him. His words stunned me because, deep down, I feared he was right. I wasn't in love with Noah, not then, but I cared deeply about him. Maybe because he allowed himself to be vulnerable while Ethan locked every emotion behind anger. Instead of talking through it, Ethan grabbed his keys and drove away. He didn't come home until the next morning smelling like whiskey. The distance between Ethan and Noah became impossible to ignore. Noah never criticized his brother. Whenever I apologized for Ethan missing another visit, Noah would simply shrug and say, "People handle pain differently." He defended Ethan every single time. Ironically, that made me even angrier at Ethan. Here was a man counting the months he had left, still making excuses for everyone else. I couldn't understand why kindness always seemed to come from the person carrying the heaviest burden. Everything changed the night Noah asked me to help him sort through old boxes in his garage. Inside were photographs, letters, trophies from high school, and a notebook filled with dreams he'd written years earlier. Travel the world, learn Italian, become a father, grow old beside someone who loved him. He quietly crossed out every dream with a black marker. I grabbed the notebook from him and asked why he was doing that. He smiled sadly and said, "No point leaving unfinished lists behind." I couldn't stop crying. He gently hugged me and whispered, "Don't waste your tears on someone who's still here." That hug lasted only a few seconds, but it left me feeling emotions I couldn't explain. It wasn't romance. It wasn't desire. It was grief mixed with helplessness. Looking back now, I can pinpoint that evening as the beginning of the end. Not because anything inappropriate happened, but because the emotional lines began to blur. I became the person Noah leaned on, and somehow he became the person I leaned on too. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Instead of asking why it happened, he assumed the worst. The arguments between us became louder and more frequent. He accused me of replacing him. I accused him of abandoning his own brother. Neither of us was entirely right, and neither of us was entirely wrong. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Noah had collapsed at home. By the time I reached the hospital, Ethan was already there sitting outside the room with his face buried in his hands. The doctors explained that the cancer had progressed much faster than expected. They weren't talking about a year anymore. They were talking about months, maybe even weeks. As I looked through the hospital window and saw Noah lying there connected to machines, smiling weakly the moment he saw us, I realized every choice we'd made up to that point was about to carry consequences none of us were prepared to face. The doctors were careful with their words, but they didn't need to say much. The look on their faces told us everything. Noah's condition had deteriorated far more quickly than anyone expected, and from that day forward, every conversation revolved around comfort instead of treatment. The aggressive plans were replaced with medication to ease the pain, and the hopeful discussions about experimental therapies quietly disappeared. Walking out of that hospital, I felt like the entire world had become unbearably quiet. Ethan didn't say a single word during the drive home. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, and I kept waiting for him to cry, scream, or even curse at the universe. Instead, he remained completely silent, as though every emotion inside him had frozen solid. Over the next few weeks, Noah decided he didn't want to spend whatever time he had left inside hospital walls. He wanted to be home, surrounded by familiar things instead of machines and fluorescent lights. His parents transformed the living room into a temporary bedroom, and family members took turns staying with him. I found myself volunteering almost every day. Sometimes I cooked meals that barely got touched because his appetite had disappeared. Other times I'd simply sit beside him while we watched old movies neither of us was really paying attention to. He talked more openly now than ever before, almost as if knowing the end was near had stripped away every reason to pretend. He admitted he wasn't afraid of dying nearly as much as he was afraid of leaving everyone else behind carrying pain they didn't deserve. Ethan tried harder after the hospital visit, and for a while I thought maybe things were finally changing. He began visiting more often, bringing his brother favorite snacks, helping their father around the house, and even sitting beside Noah for hours without saying much. But something between us had already shifted. Every conversation felt forced. Every smile seemed rehearsed. We weren't partners anymore. We were two exhausted people trying to survive the same nightmare in completely different ways. One evening, after we drove home from Noah's house, Ethan suddenly asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you think he resents me?" he whispered. I looked at him and honestly answered, "No. If anything, he loves you more than anyone." Ethan nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. As Noah grew weaker, he began asking for small favors. Nothing dramatic. He wanted someone to help organize old family photographs, write birthday cards for his nieces and nephews that they could open years later, and record messages for holidays he knew he would never see. Watching him prepare for a future he wouldn't be part of was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in his room, We found an old photograph of him and Ethan as little boys covered in mud after building a treehouse. Noah laughed so hard he started coughing. Once he caught his breath, he quietly said, "Promise me you'll make sure Ethan remembers who he is after I'm gone. He blames himself for things he can't control." Hearing that almost broke me. Even now, with death staring him in the face, he was still worrying about everyone else's happiness. The emotional weight of those weeks became almost impossible to carry. I barely slept. I cried in grocery store parking lots, in the shower, even while driving home from work. One evening, after helping Noah finish recording video messages for his family, I stayed behind while everyone else stepped outside. The room was unusually quiet. Noah stared toward the window and softly admitted that he could feel his body giving up. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply stating a fact. Then he thanked me for treating him like a person instead of a patient. I didn't know how to respond. I reached over and hugged him tightly, both of us crying without saying another word. It was an emotional moment born entirely out of grief, fear, and saying goodbye to someone who had become incredibly important to me. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way. As I walked into the hallway, Ethan had just returned after taking a phone call outside. He froze the moment he saw us pulling away from that embrace. The expression on his face wasn't anger at first, it was heartbreak. The kind of heartbreak that happens when someone sees something they can't explain but immediately assumes the worst. Before I could say anything, he turned around and walked out of the house. I chased after him, calling his name, but he ignored me completely. By the time I reached the driveway, his car was already disappearing down the street. For 2 days, Ethan refused to answer my calls. When he finally agreed to meet me, the conversation turned into the worst argument we'd ever had. He accused me of emotionally replacing him long before Noah became sick. He admitted he'd felt invisible every time he watched us laughing together or talking for hours. I tried explaining that nothing romantic had ever happened between us, that Noah had simply needed someone to listen, but grief has a way of twisting every memory into something darker. Ethan didn't believe me. Maybe he couldn't. In his mind, he had already lost his brother, and now he believed he was losing the woman he loved too. By the end of that conversation, we both knew our relationship was hanging by a thread. The tension spread through the family faster than I expected. Nobody openly accused anyone of anything, but whispers began replacing conversations whenever I entered the room. Ethan's mother seemed confused. His father barely looked at either of us. Noah, however, noticed everything immediately. One afternoon he asked why Ethan hadn't visited in several days. I tried making excuses about work, but Noah simply smiled sadly and said, "You don't have to protect me from the truth." When I finally admitted we'd argued, his face fell. He looked genuinely devastated, not because of himself, but because the people he loved were falling apart before his eyes. That evening, Noah insisted on speaking to Ethan alone. None of us knew exactly what was said behind that closed bedroom door, but when Ethan walked out nearly an hour later, his eyes were red from crying harder than I'd ever seen. He stopped beside me in the hallway, opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then quietly walked past me without another word. Noah never told me what they discussed, and Ethan refused to talk about it afterward. Whatever was said remained between two brothers sharing what they both knew might be their final honest conversation together. A few days later, I received a call just after sunrise. Noah had taken another serious turn overnight, and the family had gathered at the house. As I hurried there with my heart pounding, I couldn't shake the feeling that time had finally run out. The driveway was already full of cars. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with silence, interrupted only by quiet sobs coming from the living room. Ethan was sitting beside his brother's bed, holding his hand, tears streaming down his face as he repeatedly whispered apologies that only Noah could hear. I stood frozen in the doorway, realizing that whatever happened next would change every single one of our lives forever. By the time I stepped into the room, the sun had barely risen. Noah looked nothing like the energetic man who used to make everyone laugh at family cookouts, yet when he saw us gathered around him, he still managed the faintest smile. The room was painfully quiet, except for the occasional beep of the medical equipment that had been brought into the house. His mother sat beside him, holding one hand. His father stood near the window, trying desperately not to cry. Ethan never let go of his brother's other hand. Every few seconds he whispered another apology, as though he believed saying, "I'm sorry," enough times could somehow give Noah more time. Watching the two of them together shattered something inside me because it reminded me that beneath all the arguments, misunderstandings, and distance, they were still just two brothers who loved each other more than words could ever explain. Noah opened his eyes one last time and looked around the room slowly, almost as if he wanted to memorize every face. His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but every single person leaned closer to hear him. He told his parents he loved them and thanked them for giving him a life filled with love instead of regret. Then he looked at Ethan. I'll never forget the way his expression softened. "None of this was your fault," he whispered. "Promise me you'll stop punishing yourself." Ethan completely broke down. He buried his face into the bed and cried harder than I'd ever seen another human being cry. Noah reached out with what little strength he had left and gently squeezed his brother's hand. It was the last time they ever spoke. A few minutes later, Noah peacefully slipped away, surrounded by the people who loved him most. Nobody screamed. Nobody collapsed dramatically. Instead, the room filled with a silence so overwhelming it almost hurt. His mother rested her forehead against his shoulder. His father quietly walked outside because he couldn't bear to let anyone see him cry. Ethan remained frozen beside the bed, staring at his brother's face as though he expected him to wake up at any second. I stood in the corner, unable to move, realizing that the kindest person I'd ever known was gone forever. The funeral was held several days later, and it felt as though the entire town had come to say goodbye. Friends, former classmates, coworkers, neighbors, people I had never even met, shared stories about Noah's generosity. One man stood up and admitted Noah had secretly paid his rent years earlier when he was struggling. A woman revealed Noah had spent months helping her son prepare for college entrance exams without asking for anything in return. Story after story painted the same picture. Noah had quietly changed lives without ever expecting recognition. Listening to everyone speak made me realize that while cancer had stolen his future, it had never stolen the legacy of kindness he left behind. After the funeral, Ethan and I tried to hold our relationship together, but grief had changed us both too much. We finally sat down one evening and had the first honest conversation we'd had in months. He admitted he had allowed his fear to turn into anger and had pushed away everyone who wanted to help him. I admitted that I had become emotionally dependent on Noah's friendship during the hardest period of my life, even though there had never been a romantic relationship between us. We both apologized for the things we'd said, but apologies couldn't erase the damage. Sometimes love simply isn't enough to repair people who have been broken in different ways. A few weeks later, we quietly ended our relationship. For a long time, I carried guilt everywhere I went. I replayed every conversation, every hug, every decision, wondering if I'd somehow contributed to the pain that surrounded Noah's final months. Therapy eventually helped me understand something important. Grief doesn't always make people act rationally. It magnifies fear, loneliness, and insecurity until even innocent moments can be misunderstood. That realization didn't erase my sadness, but it allowed me to stop blaming myself for things I couldn't change. I also stopped blaming Ethan. He wasn't a villain. He was a grieving brother trying to survive the unimaginable. Nearly 3 years have passed since Noah died. Ethan and I haven't spoken in a very long time. From what I've heard through mutual friends, he's doing better. He volunteers with a cancer support organization and spends time talking to families going through the same nightmare ours did. Part of me smiles every time I hear that because I know Noah would be incredibly proud of him. As for me, I still visit Noah's grave every year on his birthday. I bring fresh flowers, sit quietly for a while, and remember the man who taught me that kindness can outlive a person. If there's one lesson I took away from everything that happened, it's this. Don't wait until someone is running out of time to tell them you love them, forgive them, or simply be present. We spend so much of our lives assuming there will always be another birthday, another holiday, another conversation. Sometimes there isn't. Life can change with one diagnosis, one phone call, or one sunrise. The people we love don't need perfect words. They need our time while we still have it. And if Noah taught me anything, it's that a person's life isn't measured by how long they live. It's measured by the lives they leave better than they found them. He left this world far too soon, but he also left behind a reminder that compassion, forgiveness, and love can echo long after we're gone. I hope that's how he's remembered, because that's certainly how I'll remember him for the rest of my life. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.